there is a disconnect between the high level of homelessness in Seattle and the high number of affordable housing units that are sitting unused. As of the end of last year, nearly 11% of affordable housing in the city was empty, more than 2,700 apartments. That's more than 5 times the number of vacancies compared to 7 years ago. So what's happening? Well, for many, affordable housing is ironically no longer the affordable option. A flattening of rents overall has made these units less desirable than many other market rate options. And even though these units are sitting empty, it's unlikely they're going to be opened for Seattle's growing homeless population. Greg Kim is the Seattle Times homelessness reporter, and he's been digging in on these issues related to housing and our homelessness crisis in the region. And he joins me now. Hey, Greg, thank you so much for being back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Libby.
So first off, I guess for folks who don't know, what defines affordable housing in Seattle and who is usually renting these units?
Yeah, well, the technical definition of affordable housing is that it costs no more than 30% of the income of the person living in it. And that can happen a couple different ways. You know, you might just have cheap rent, or you might make a lot of money, or the government might give you what's called a housing voucher, which helps subsidize your rent. But when officials talk about affordable housing, or they talk about building affordable housing, what they're talking about is structures or housing that the government helped build, right? So they're usually built and operated by other organizations like nonprofits or for-profit organizations. And the government helps pay for some percentage of the cost to build it, usually between 40 to 90% of the cost to build it. And then in exchange for that, the organizations running the affordable housing, they cap the rent to be affordable to low-income people, which is defined as people making up to 80% of the area median income.
And your reporting shows that of this affordable housing, a lot of it is focused on the upper end of that spectrum, right? When we're talking about the average affordable unit in Seattle, who is actually renting these and how much money are they making?
Affordable housing is a huge range, but most of the units are built at the upper end of what's considered low income. These are people making more than 50% of the area median income. That's right now $55,000 for an individual in Seattle. These are people making well above minimum wage. Think servers or baristas or janitors.
And what has changed in the last 7 years so that the vacancy of these apartments, these affordable units that the government has subsidized, has suddenly jumped so much? Again, about 7 years ago, the vacancy rates were hovering around 2%. Now they're over 10%. What's going on, Greg? Why so many more vacancies today in affordable housing units?
Yeah, you explained it really well in the intro, in that these affordable housing units are still considered affordable by this government definition for people making 50% of the area median income, 60% of the area median income, but they're no longer a good deal, at least in comparison to the private market. So the rent prices within affordable housing have overlapped with what people can find on their own in the private market. And that's happened because of two things. One, affordable housing has gotten more expensive over the years because the cap is based on a formula based on the median income, and Seattle's gotten a lot wealthier over the years, so affordable housing rents have gone up a lot. At the same time, in the private market, developers have been building like crazy. Everyone saw the cranes all around the city. Interest rates were historically low, and they built so many apartments. Increased supply means lower prices. And so in the private market, rents have actually flattened over the last 7 years. And those two things are what's led to this overlap in rent prices between the affordable and private market.
So basically, all these efforts to try to get more units built with the promise that you would see rents start to stabilize or go down, those have actually come to fruition, is what I'm hearing you say, Greg. Those promises of, hey, we're going to be able to slow the insane growth of rents if we just build more units. However, what that's meant is that at the same time, the private market rents are starting to kind of flatten. You see the expectations of the affordable housing market still going up and up and up. And now a renter in Seattle looking at a one bedroom or a studio is saying, actually, it's a better deal or about the same deal to go with a privately rented apartment rather than affordable housing. Do I have that right?
Exactly. And one thing I want to emphasize in what you said is that increased supply actually did keep prices from increasing. That's something that not everyone believes, that is basic economic theory that isn't universally accepted. And we've seen the proof already. And that is something that I think as a public, we need to understand is basic economic tenets.
So if we think of the housing market right now as sort of like a Venn diagram where there is this center point where the private market and the affordable housing market is overlapping. So the publicly subsidized market and the private market. And in that center overlap oval sits a lot of renters who right now are choosing to go with the private market rather than the affordable housing market. Why don't affordable housing providers just start to lower rents?
It's a great question. It's the obvious question to ask in this situation. And it goes back to, as I described, how this affordable housing is built, right? The government subsidizes a portion of the cost to build it, right? Like somewhere between 40 to 90% usually. And what is happening is that these organizations still have a loan that they need to make payments on. Otherwise, they're going to default. They're going to get their buildings taken from them. They're going to go bankrupt. And so there's a threshold that they need to hit, right? And so yeah, the obvious solution here is to lower their rent, which a lot of them are doing. But there's a point at which if they lower them beyond a threshold, then they won't be able to meet their loan payments. And they've already been operating on thin margins. Affordable housing is designed to not make anyone rich, right? So it's already operating on thin margins. They can't lower them beyond a certain point without not meeting their loan payments. And obviously some money is better than no money. But the calculus that they're making is that if they bring in someone who can only get them to a certain point of meeting that threshold, then they're going to have that tenant for a long time, right? They're not going to be able to kick them out for some period of time. And so they will be continuing to not meet their loan payments for a long time. And that's a long-term financial problem some of these organizations are wary of getting themselves stuck in.
So it seems like there was this big push to add more affordable housing units. The city of Seattle was subsidizing a lot of this. So there were state programs, there were other public money being plowed into this. But a lot of those units that were being built were targeted for people who are at the upper end of the eligibility spectrum for affordable housing. So now you have those people leaving the affordable housing market because of the availability of pretty similar options in the private market. And yet those units are still out of reach for a good chunk of people who are eligible for affordable housing. Is this about changing our expectations for who will be renting affordable units? Where does the change need to be made in order to meet the moment, do you think, Greg?
Every year in Seattle, there's tens of millions, more than $100 million of affordable housing that's allocated every year between all of the levels of government that subsidize affordable housing. And every year at that point, they are deciding how many units to build at different income levels, right? And for a long time, the assumption was that there was such a great housing need that it didn't matter where in that spectrum they built for. And the mantra was just build more housing. It almost doesn't matter what we build. There's a high need everywhere. And I think there's a shift in calculus in that decision that is going to need to be made where oh, well, maybe there are points in this spectrum that are much higher need than others. And so it's at that point in the year where they're allocating the affordable housing dollars, where they're going to need to use more data to see where the highest needs within that affordable housing spectrum are.
So it's not just about building the most number of affordable units, no matter who they're serving. It's about where is the highest need within that range of people who qualifies for affordable housing and adjusting, basically, even if that means fewer units because they have to be more highly subsidized at the lower end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that will be somewhat difficult because of the political incentives involved here. Whenever you hear an official talk about affordable housing, probably the only thing you've ever heard is how many units they're building. And it's just a lot more complicated to explain to your constituents that you built fewer units, but they were for poor people and where there's a greater need. Like, it's much easier to just say, hey, I built 2,000 units of affordable housing. And that political incentive is not going to go away. So, yes, but it's going to be difficult.
So one example you use is the Thai Bin apartment building that you report had about a rate of 20% vacancy out of the whole building. About 50 units were vacant. And outside of that property, while you're looking inside and there's 50 units vacant, there are unhoused people who are looking at the building and saying, sure, I'd love to live there. I would love to move in. When we see a situation like that, Greg, I think the first impulse is to just say, well, why doesn't the city just pay for these unhoused people to move in to the building? Can you kind of demystify this for us? Why doesn't that happen? Why isn't that an option? Or is the city considering doing that?
It's possible, like anything is possible. Like, they're talking about converting office buildings into housing. You could totally convert low income housing into housing for homeless people. That's totally possible. The answer why that's difficult is obviously just money. You would have to subsidize the buildings further. One, because homeless or formerly homeless people wouldn't be able to afford the rents that are needed to break even on those loans right now. But on top of that, homeless or formerly homeless people require services for their health conditions or mental health conditions that they might have developed on during their years on the street. And all of that requires ongoing operating expenses. So not only would you have to subsidize it one time to bring the rents down, but you would also need to subsidize it ongoing to pay for those services that those people would need. But in the end, the answer is just money.
I was interested to hear the response from the city to your reporting, which is an expectation that this may resolve on its own. What did you hear from city officials?
Yeah. One, the city officials have their hands full with the affordable housing sector. It's not in a great place for other reasons, right? Like their expenses have shot through the roof over the last 5+ years during the pandemic, and they've been dealing with an issue where more of their tenants are not paying their rent on time, and so they are already plugging budget gaps in the sector. And so when I asked them about this issue of vacancies, yeah, they said that they expect it to go away on their own. And that's because right now, private developers aren't building very many new apartments at all. With the interest rates that have doubled and construction costs having increased so much during the pandemic, very few are building new apartments. And so what city officials are expecting is that over the next few years, then as that supply shrinks, then rents in the private market are going to shoot up. And then the affordable housing rents will look good or affordable by comparison. And that's what they're expecting to happen with these vacancies.
So they think this is just a temporary issue, and we are going to see another big jump in rents in the private market in not too long. That's ominous.
Exactly. And that would be a solution for the affordable housing sector. It would fill those vacancies, but it's not exactly a solution for renters overall.
Yeah, or people who can't afford those upper end affordable units. It feels weird to be talking about affordable units as upper end, but this is where we're at. Like, there are people with different needs, and there needs to be units to accommodate that. Greg, I think we've kind of covered most of what, your beats here in the story that you reported for the Seattle Times. I think it's a really important examination of the way in the story that you reported for the Seattle Times. I think it's a really important examination of the way affordable housing works in the city, of the way that even though it's affordable, it still needs to understand market conditions and respond to it, especially in the planning stages. Going forward, you mentioned there are huge problems in the affordable housing space. There's been a number of providers that are selling buildings, a lot of issues with the business of affordable housing in the city. What else do you think you're going to be watching for as this story unfolds? Or what else do you want people to know about what's been going on?
Yeah, I think what I'm curious about is whether elected officials and the public's understanding of affordable housing and the needs in our housing market are going to adapt. As we were talking about before, the answer was always just more. It makes sense as a mantra, but also will officials reckon with the fact that there is more need at certain parts of the market, and that the response from officials and the public to the problems in the housing market have all been concentrated in one place in that market? Are we going to get more nuanced about affordable housing? That's the thing that I'm curious about.
Two thoughts before I go. One is that, again, as we said, more units, particularly in the private sector, did flatten rents. So more is not necessarily the wrong mantra. It's just, where are you talking about more? And the second thought is, a lot of these units you're talking about that you reported on in the upper end of the affordability space, they were 1-bedroom and studio apartments. And I kept asking myself, what about people with kids? What about families? And, people in workforce housing that need more than a studio? What kind of options do they have, and has there been enough building in that space? Anyway, I know you're going to be doing a lot more reporting on this, Greg. Thank you very much for being here and for all of the work that you do covering housing and homelessness in the Seattle area. Greg Kim, Seattle Times homelessness reporter. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Libby.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.